And now we return to our main story of the night, peace talks in Islamabad. What, if anything, did they bring, and are we any closer to getting the Strait of Hormuz open for global shipping? To discuss, I'm now joined by Mark Toth from Interp 360. Mark, hello, great to see you, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Don, great to see you, and greetings to your viewers.
Yes, now, without knowing the exact outcome, because there have been no announcements thus far, but we do know these are the highest level talks that Iran and the United States have had since the revolution back in 1979. So is this at least a good sign that maybe diplomacy has a chance and could take course?
Don, it's a great question. In a normal environment with past presidents, if you were sending someone of the vice president's stature, you would think that there was some kind of breakthrough in the meeting. But the Trump presidency, as we know, is not a normal presidency. They do things differently. They think out of the box. And so it's a little bit difficult to determine exactly what Vance's presence there means. I mean, there clearly was a lot of reporting that the Iranians wanted to see him. They view him more as a dove as opposed to a hawk. And they apparently do not trust Woodcock and Kushner, given that the last time they were deep in negotiations with him, the U.S. Jointly with Israel conducted preemptive strikes, the one that killed Khamenei. So, I think it's hopeful. I think someone that of his stature is there, maybe can break through some of the deadlocks that exist. But personally, I doubt it. I really think we're probably seeing this ceasefire still as someplace that's on a road to nowhere, as opposed to a peace agreement. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my own interpretation of it at this point.
Right. Well, talk about thinking outside the box. I mean, negotiations in Islamabad are for the purpose of using diplomacy, yet Trump says the U.S. is clearing out the Strait of Hormuz. Why the mixed signals? And at this point, do Trump's military threats of, utter destruction, do they still hold the same weight that they may have held, say, earlier in the conflict?
Yeah, no, exactly. Over the past 24, 36 hours, we've seen a lot of what I would call diplomatic condition setting. Iran has been trying to control the narrative, at least for their own domestic consumption, that they've got several red lines, including protecting Hezbollah in Lebanon, in terms of maintaining their enrichment and getting the U.S. to release all the sanctions before the negotiations even began. The U.S. pushed back against that. But most notably, Iran has continued to say, look, the control of the straits is going to be ours going forward, and that they want the U.S. to acknowledge that. So I think today's messaging back from Trump and the United States military by sending those two destroyers through the Straits of Hormuz, something notably that I noticed just before we came on air, that Iran is denying that they didn't happen, but they did. That was sent to signal to the negotiating team, Iran's negotiating team in Islamabad, that we're not playing games. So one way or the other, the United States is going to reopen the straits. Now, having said that, a quick caveat to that, Iran clearly views the Strait of Hormuz as its best card. And it's going to use that and remain hardline about that, because I think they see that as a path to still saving Hezbollah, potentially saving their ballistic missiles and their nuclear missile enrichment program at some point. So I'm not surprised where we're at, this messaging happening between Washington and Tehran.
Yeah, it is a significant card if you look at the bigger picture. With these two destroyers going through the Strait of Hormuz today, do you think that this is maybe a precursor to U.S. Navy escorts to try and force the strait open and get some of that oil out to world markets?
Right. Yeah. Don, when you look at the actual statement that was put out by CENTCOM, there were two messages there. One, that it was a freedom of navigation. That's a clear sign, clear messaging to Tehran, especially to the IRGC. You can claim the strait of your own, but we're not viewing it that way as the United States. So it was a freedom of navigation patrol. But the other part of that statement also said that it was beginning to set conditions for the elimination of mines, if they exist, and they do, in the Strait of Hormuz itself. And so it was the start of an operation to show the United States Navy could do just that. And I would argue there probably was a third aspect to it. I think the Trump administration wanted to test the reaction of Iran during these negotiations to see whether or not they would react. So it was a way of carrying a big stick right through the heart of what Iran believes to be their strongest card, the Strait of Hormuz, and Iran chose not to react. So from a U.S. standpoint, that's encouraging. I'd argue from a Western standpoint as well. They didn't want to get into a fight, at least at this point, again with the U.S., although that fight may resume at any point in time.
Mark Rutte said that there could be a potential NATO role here in the greater Middle East. Do you see maybe a potential for a NATO role specifically in the Strait of Hormuz?
Perhaps post-war. Look, at this point, I wish on both sides of the Atlantic, cooler heads would prevail here. NATO is too important to the security of Europe, especially Eastern Europe. And the U.S. participation in that is a key component of it. I get it. Europe understandably is offended by the way that Trump has treated them, and he has treated them badly. There's been a lot of needless rhetoric coming out of the White House from Trump himself, as well as J.D. Vance. Back to that Munich conference almost 2 years ago, but not quite. But having said that, both sides need each other. And I think Europe has an opportunity here to be the adults in the room, if you will, and to say, look, we get it that we should have a role, ideally participating with the U.S. now as opposed to waiting to a post-war environment. But if post-war is all that they could do, that's better than nothing.
I want to address the negotiating team, at least from the United States side. The Iranian side has 70 members in total, a really massive delegation. And the U.S., is spearheaded by Vice President J.D. Vance, together with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Kushner says the United States could or will supply nuclear fuel to Iran for civilian purposes. Vance, however, says that there can be no enrichment for Iran. And it seems like the same negotiating team, yet of two very separate messages. Is the United States correct in doing the negotiations this way? You would think that the Secretary of State would be the person to negotiate this, and professional diplomats rather than a son-in-law, a real estate agent, a real estate professional, and the vice president.
Yeah, no, excellent observation, Don. These are not the people that you want leading the negotiations. Typically, a vice president you would bring in to basically seal the deal once you were 99% there. More of a ceremonial role than anything else. The fact that he's leading these discussions is problematic. The fact that also that he's accompanied by Witkoff and Jared Kushner, who, in my opinion, have messed up every negotiation they've been a part of, especially in Ukraine, when it comes to Putin and Kirill Dmitriev. These aren't the guys you want there. And just before we came on air, I tried to confirm again, literally 20 seconds ago, before we started, whether or not Admiral Brad Cooper was there, the guy that you want to see there, because this is much a military message to be sent to the Iranian negotiators. But so far, despite some rumors that his plane is there by OSENT accounts, I can't get anyone that's on the ground there from major new publications, including the New York Post, to say that Cooper is there. So that's troublesome. But then if you look quickly on the other side to the Iranian team, it is full of IRGC hardliners, from top to bottom. There are some pragmatists involved, but clearly the IRGC is the kingmakers behind this negotiation process. Galibrev may be the face, but a man by the name of Vakidi, who's the commander of the IRGC in Tehran and throughout Iran, he's the one that's going to be the ultimate decision maker. So it's just troubling because there is an imbalance, as you point out. The U.S. has amateurs. The Iranians have brought a very polished diplomatic team, and a very hardline one at that.
Yes, so still very far from total regime change, and definitely not a more relaxed one. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and ask you about Kirill Dmitriev, who is in the United States, or was in the United States, trying to negotiate an extension on the sanctions, waiver for Russian oil. He's also trying to negotiate, apparently, better conditions for U.S.-Russia economic cooperation. What can you tell us on this front? What is Russia trying to do? And do you think the Easter ceasefire that Vladimir Putin finally agreed to is a result of trying to better position himself in the United States?
Yeah, typically when Kirill Dmitriev shows up in the U.S., nothing good happens from it, from a Ukrainian standpoint. He comes off with some other deal, usually pivoting around Ukraine capitulating the Donbass and ceding all of that, including its fortress belt, back to Moscow. This time, however, I think Dmitriev's trip to the U.S. is he's the one with the hands out. Putin is desperate. Ukraine has done an incredible job. Perhaps 40% of the oil infrastructure has either been destroyed or degraded inside of Russia, and that's creating huge budgetary issues for them. As much as 42 or 47% off the top of my head of their oil revenues are gone from year over year. And so Russia is facing major budgetary issues. Ukraine also, through its drone warfare, has done an incredible job of eliminating more Russian soldiers on the battlefield in a month than Russia can reintroduce in new troops. So they're winning that war of attrition that has been stagnant for some time. So I think Kirill Dmitriev's purpose in the U.S. is probably twofold. He wants to see those sanctions relieved because Russia is not getting the windfall that they thought they were going to get out of the Iran war, because you can't sell and you can't make a profit of what you can't get to market. And Ukraine is making sure a lot of that oil, at least 40% of it, can't. And so they need more sanctions relieved. The other side of it is he realizes probably that, Putin needs some kind of ceasefire, only as an operational pause. I don't think Putin is ready to give up yet. But he's faced in a corner, and right now Ukraine has the cards. Putin does not, in my opinion.
Certainly. Well, I may sound like a broken record to our viewers, but the sanctions that Ukraine puts on Russian oil are the best sanctions there are. Mark Toth from Interp 360, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Always appreciate it.
Pleasure. We're two broken records in that regard. Cheers.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.